there's no way to fix property taxation. Now, I deal with the whole morality of taxation in another video, episode 2.4, I think it is, of FPTV, but just from a practical position, think of the following. Let's say that I'm leaving my office in Oshawa and I'm going to go buy a product in Toronto. I'm going to take my car. I'm not going to drive right to the store because maybe I think the traffic's too heavy where I'm going. So I'm going to park my car in a city parking spot that's probably subsidized somewhat by the local taxpayer. I'm going to be walking the sidewalks that were paid for by somebody else. I'm going to be riding on the roads that were paid for by somebody else. I'm going to be drinking the water that's purified at the cost of somebody else. I'm going to be flushing the toilets that are full of that water. Somebody's going to be cleaning those public toilets, and it's going to be an employee probably of the municipality who's paid by the Toronto taxpayer. All kinds of things are provided to the general public by the municipality, and the municipality is paid by property taxes primarily. That's where they're getting their money. All of those things are paid for by the people who own property or live in Toronto, but they're not paid for by the visitors, by the commuters, by anybody else, because we own property outside of Toronto. So we get to ride free on the coattails of people who have properties in Toronto, who pay for properties in Toronto, who pay property taxes. Does the Homestead Act change that at all? No, it doesn't. It just changes the rate at which one Torontonian pays tax versus the rate at which another person pays tax. The rate at which those two rates change over time. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that other people living outside of Toronto are using municipal services and not paying for them. A property tax is not, as a practical matter, never mind moral. I mean, moral is the main problem I have with them, but as a practical matter, they're an utter failure. They rip people off who live in the town because they're paying for services that aren't even consumed by them. They're consumed by people visiting from out of town who aren't paying at all. Well, how do you make it more fair? Well, the easy way to do it is to make sure that you get what you pay for and you pay only for what you get. In other words, when you, for example, run the tap in your house, you're paying by the volume of water that you consume. You're not just paying a flat rate and all the water you want is poured into your swimming pool or into your glass. That water's paid for, is metered, and you're paying according to the amount you use. Well, the same should be done for everything that's used in Toronto, whether used by someone who lives in Toronto or whether used by someone who's just visiting or commuting to Toronto or working in Toronto or using services in Toronto, buying goods in Toronto, shopping in Toronto. Everybody who uses publicly supplied services should be paying for them, no matter where they live. And they should be paying the government that supplies them. And if it's the Toronto government, for example, and I'm coming in from out of town and I'm using services that are paid for by the Toronto government, I should be paying the Toronto government for the money it's spent on me, an out-of-towner. And that goes for every town. If I visit London, Ontario, I should be paying for the services that I use that were provided by the City of London. And if I visit Peterborough or Cornwall or Ottawa, Hamilton, any place at all, no matter what size, if I visit Wawa, again, I should be paying for the services that I consume that are supplied by the municipal government. Now, how do you do that? Well, you do it by imposing a tax on consumption. Tax me for what I consume. Now, we already have a tax like that in the province. It's called the provincial sales tax, the PST. And it's taxed at 8%. Now, it doesn't apply to all services. It doesn't apply, for example, to legal services. I'm a lawyer. I don't charge PST for my services. I'm not required by law to do so. Frankly, I think that's a problem, because that means because they're only taxing some services or goods and not all, they have to raise the rate. The rate has to be higher because they need to generate some amount of revenue using that sales tax. And if they're not going to tax more things, they have to tax a smaller number of things at a higher rate. So the first step that should be done is to broaden that tax base, broaden the number of things that are subject to the tax, but to lower the rate. Right now the rate's 8%. That rate should be lowered, I think, below 8%. And it can be lowered without affecting anything, without affecting the amount of tax brought in, provided that the tax base, the number of things you're taxing, is broadened, so that, for example, legal services should be taxed. If I go to Toronto and I use a lawyer who does business in Toronto, then when I pay his bill, I should be paying for some of the municipal services that I received while I was in Toronto visiting him and using his services. Well, how would you do this as a practical matter? Well, you'd simply allow each municipality to impose a premium on the existing PST. There's no need to set up a whole new tax regime with a whole new set of documents and a whole new bureaucracy. All you really need to do is say that the provincial sales tax will have tacked onto it a premium, a municipal sales tax, if you want to call it that. And the rate of that tax will differ from municipality to municipality according to the needs of the municipality as determined by the elected politicians, who will take full responsibility for every tax increase they impose, and if they impose a tax that's too high, well, they're going to feel the wrath of the taxpayer, as they should. But there should be no property tax. In other words, this is a switch. This isn't both. This isn't saying, well, keep paying the property tax plus put a retail sales tax in. This is saying, get rid of property taxation altogether. Once a person buys their house, they own it. They bought it with after-tax dollars. They shouldn't have to pay to keep it. Now, you might be saying, well, that's all fine, McKeever, but you're just talking out of your hat. You don't know what the rate would be. It would be, 12, 13, 14, 26, 90%. What percentage would it be, McKeever? Well, I have done the research, as a matter of fact. All you have to do is talk to Statistics Canada, and they'll give you the information you need to know about how much property tax was collected province-wide, right across Ontario. Lump all the municipalities together in terms of how much property tax they imposed and collected. Put that in one pile. And then look at the amount of PST collected in that same year. Put that in another pile. Figure out by what percentage the PST would have to be increased to replace all the revenue currently collected by property taxes. And you get an answer. And the answer comes in at just under 5%. In other words, if you replaced the property tax with a sales tax a municipal sales tax just under 5%. In other words, you added a municipal premium to the PST, slightly less than 5%, bringing the total PST up to, let's say, 13%, or just under. Then you could eliminate the property tax altogether. And what would happen when the out-of-towner comes into town? Well, if Paul McKeever comes into Toronto to visit a lawyer and pay for a lawyer's services, with this broadened tax base on the PST, he'd pay a sales tax on the legal services. He'd pay that 5% municipal sales tax that was imposed by the City of Toronto. And that would go a long way to covering the expenses that he was causing the city to incur during his stay for water, and public washrooms and roads and everything else that McKeever uses when he's visiting Toronto. Things that right now are being paid for by the Toronto homeowner would be paid for by Paul McKeever, visitor to Toronto. The services that he consumes, he pays for through the sales taxes that he pays, the municipal sales tax that he pays. Now, of course, you wouldn't have to have a 5% sales tax in every town necessarily. Some towns wouldn't need that much. There might be towns that need more. But the beauty would be that every town would have to be very cautious not to go crazy with raising taxes, because they'd have to realize that the neighboring town may use tax policy as a way to attract business and customers and buyers to its jurisdiction. Let's say that you're living in Toronto, and let's say to replace all of the property tax collected by Toronto, you need, let's say, a 5% municipal sales tax to be tacked on to the 8% PST. So total of 13%. Let's say that Mayor Miller says, yeah, but let's add an extra percent on there. Let's round it up and let's call it 14%, because I'd like to build a new museum, the David Miller Museum of Popular Art. Yeah, it'll be great, and it'll only cost 1 extra percent, he says. Now Miller has to concern himself with this, because all of a sudden, if he goes ahead with his plan to build the museum, the David Miller Museum of Art, and to raise taxes 1% to pay for it, well, he may be driving business away from Toronto. And there's going to be a lot of Toronto business persons and customers saying, hey, what are you doing? You're driving everybody away. Forget your museum of art, stick to the basics, get the roads in working order, and let's not play games here. We've got competitors all around us who are only too willing to keep their taxes to responsible levels, impose only the taxes that are necessary to pay for proper municipal expenses, and by doing that, they're attracting business to their municipality. Stop goofing around. And if you don't stop goofing around, we're not voting for you next time. You're not going to be Mayor Miller anymore. You're going to be former Mayor Miller. Now, I have nothing necessarily against David Miller, don't get me wrong. He just happens to be the mayor of Toronto at this time, so I'm just giving you an example. And I don't have any knowledge that he wants to build a David Miller Museum. I don't think he does. But you know and I know that across Ontario there are all kinds of municipal mistakes that are made. Mistakes made by municipal councils and mayors to build boondoggles that lose money and really are nothing more than monuments and wastes of money that cost the taxpayer unnecessary taxes. Well, a sales tax, a competitive sales tax, is a way to keep everybody responsible and to give the taxpayer a way of knowing right away that somebody is raising taxes. Keep in mind, property taxes, you don't get to see those every day. You buy a chocolate bar, or a bottle of water, you get your photographs developed, or any of these things. Well, you'll see a sales tax figure on there. And imagine if you looked at your bill every day and you saw a Miller tax, 6%. And you go to Oshawa and you see a Gray tax, Mayor Gray tax, and his tax is only, let's say, 4%. Well, when you get home to Toronto, you're going to be saying, what's with our town? How come our mayor's putting taxes up to 6%, the municipal sales tax up to 6%? How come they can manage with 4% in Oshawa, or in Barrie, or in London? I'm kind of angry. And if he doesn't get this taxing under control, he might find that he's not getting my vote next time. That's the kind of power that the voter gets out of having the tax rate printed right there on every receipt they get. They know that they're being taxed extra. They can compare from town to town which town's taxing the least, and they know when their town is getting a little crazy with the taxes. As a practical matter, a sales tax is a far better tax than a property tax. It not only makes sure that out-of-towners pay for the stuff they consume when they're in town, it also makes sure that everybody knows what rate of taxation they're paying, how it's calculated. It's easy to look at a receipt after paying for some good or service you've consumed, and to see, mayor's tax, this percentage. It's a pretty simple thing, a sales tax. Unlike the property tax, where you have to figure out what the mill rate is and how much your property is being assessed at, and weight that according to the other ones that are in town. I mean, you practically have to be an astrophysicist with a lot of time on your hands to figure out what your tax bill is going to be at the end of the year. Whereas, if you look at a simple slip that comes out of the register, it says right on there, 5% David Miller tax, or 4%, or 3%, or 1%, or 6%, whatever it is, you know what the percentage is, and you find it very easy to compare with neighboring towns. That's power. That's power for the voter, and that's accountability for the politician, who no longer can hide behind, well, MPAC, it's different for everybody, and it's not different for everybody when it's a sales tax. Everybody's paying at the same rate. No longer, when you think you're being overtaxed, are you the only guy. I mean, if you get overtaxed with the property tax, you're probably in a fairly unique situation. You have a house worth a certain amount that not a lot of other people's houses are worth. You have a mill rate that is only appropriate to your town, but you won't even know what it is because it's not written on anything that you see on a regular basis. You're going to have to practically research what it is. Whereas a sales tax is going to be printed right there on your receipt every time you buy something in town. And everybody, knowing what the rate is, will be in the same frame of mind, and those who don't like the rate will all be together. They won't be one person all alone fighting in a tax appeal. Instead, there'll be hundreds or thousands of people with picket signs out in front of City Hall. A sales tax will give the voter and the taxpayer power that he currently lacks to complain about excessive taxation. And it'll take away from politicians the power to say, hey, well, it's not my fault, blame MPAC. Oh, it's all mysterious. Bad MPAC. Sorry, I can't help you. Talk to them. Why don't you appeal one at a time, all separately, not together? The whole property tax system divides so that they can conquer. You can't get together with other people and complain to your mayor about your property tax assessment because everyone's assessed at a slightly different number, or sometimes a dramatically different number. Maybe different things were in their vicinity that affected the price. Some are closer to commercial district, some are closer to a jail, some are closer to a police station, some are closer to a firehouse. Everybody's different in terms of what they're near and why their house is worth what it's worth. But none of that is relevant when it comes to a sales tax. Everybody living in the town has the same sales tax. They all know what it is, and they all have the power then to decide whether they're for it or against it, as it were. And if they're against it, they know where to complain, where to bring their complaint, and it's not to MPAC or some mysterious body or some courtroom where they fight over their particular plight. Instead, they're out on the lawn of the City Hall with pickets in their hands saying, lower that municipal tax rate or you're losing my vote in the next election. A sales tax is power, and it's also fair. It makes sure that people pay for the services they consume, and it makes sure that they only consume the services they pay for. You gotta love the sun, eh?